Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into some fascinating ideas today on relationships from a fresh perspective. We've got some podcasts lined up that'll really make you think, especially if you consider yourself an independent thinker.
I think this is going to be interesting, challenging those traditional relationship models, right? Always a good time.
Exactly. And, the podcasts we're looking at, well, they start by sort of defining what it actually means to be an independent thinker.
Okay.
And some of the things they highlight are like a strong sense of autonomy and love for deep thinking, and actually a real comfort with solitude. Does that ring a bell at all?
Yeah, definitely, for sure. I mean, it's not just like, some personality quirk or something.
Right.
These podcasts argue that it's becoming much more prevalent, especially among knowledge workers.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, those who thrive in environments that demand a lot of intellectual horsepower. I mean, think about it. The rise of remote work, the gig economy, the constant need for innovation. It's all kind of like a breeding ground for independent thinking.
It's true. It's true. And that's where the friction starts.
Okay.
Because these podcasts point out that this independent mindset can clash pretty hard with the traditional relationship model, which often emphasizes constant contact and a lot of emotional reliance.
Yeah, it's almost like speaking two different languages. If you're someone who thrives on solitude and really needs that mental space to process and create, being bombarded with texts all the time or feeling pressured to constantly manage someone else's emotions, well, it can be incredibly draining.
Absolutely.
It's almost like trying to write a novel in a crowded coffee shop. You might get some work done,
Right.
but it's not exactly ideal.
Not ideal, definitely. And these podcasts actually don't shy away from those downsides. They really get into it. Talking about how all that emotional entanglement can actually cloud judgment,
Oh, for sure.
disrupt productivity, especially for those who need those focused bursts of energy to do their best work,
Yeah.
and even lead to stress, from all those unspoken, often vague emotional expectations that come with the territory.
Oh, I know all about that. It really begs the question, though, like, if the traditional model is causing so much friction, what's the alternative for these independent thinkers?
Well, get this, because these podcasts actually propose a pretty radical shift. They actually suggest a new model that prioritizes depth of interaction over frequency.
Okay.
So instead of constant communication, it's about those rare, incredibly enriching encounters where you can connect on a truly intellectual level.
Interesting.
It's like two scientists meeting up once a month to share their latest breakthroughs. It's focused, it's stimulating, and without all the day-to-day noise.
Oh, I love that analogy. That's so good. It really does capture the essence of this new model. It's about quality over quantity, prioritizing those moments where you can truly engage with each other's minds. And that's where the whole concept of intellectual collaboration comes in.
I was going to say.
It's about partners inspiring each other, challenging each other's thinking, and helping each other grow intellectually, all without the constant pressure of having to be emotionally available 24/7.
So it's not about being emotionally distant.
Right.
It's about finding a different way to connect. It's a different kind of fuel for the relationship.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that for some people, that intellectual stimulation is a powerful form of intimacy.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. But even with all this intellectual stimulation, boundaries still seem crucial, right? I mean, wouldn't this
Yeah.
model be a recipe for disaster without some really clear lines?
Absolutely. And the podcasts actually emphasize this repeatedly. They talk about setting fixed times for those deep conversations, respecting each other's need for solitude, and even making, major decisions independently. It's about recognizing that autonomy isn't a threat to the relationship. It's actually a source of strength.
And it's interesting because one of the podcasts actually ties this back to Susan Cain's work on introversion.
Oh,
And it highlights how solitude is essential for creativity and personal growth. It suggests that having that space within a relationship might actually be a superpower.
it's like having a built-in recharge station.
Right.
And let's not forget, the practical benefits too. I mean, clear boundaries can simplify the relationship and reduce a lot of unnecessary emotional strain.
Oh, for sure.
Think about it, less time decoding subtle emotional cues, less pressure to be constantly on, and more freedom to pursue individual passions. Sounds pretty appealing, doesn't it?
It does. It does. But let's address the elephant in the room, the idea of value exchange in this model.
Okay.
The podcast contrasts it with the more emotionally driven investments of traditional relationships. And that might make some people a little uncomfortable. How do they explain that?
It's definitely a shift in perspective, but the key here is to understand that this value exchange isn't about keeping score or treating the relationship like some kind of business transaction. It's about recognizing that independent thinkers, they often derive deep satisfaction from intellectual stimulation and shared growth. It's about inspiring each other's minds.
So instead of bringing each other coffee in the morning, you might share a fascinating article or discuss a challenging philosophical concept.
Exactly. And they even give some examples like exploring philosophical ideas together or helping each other work through professional challenges. It's about connecting, supporting each other's intellectual journeys without that constant need for emotional reassurance or grand gestures. It's a different kind of intimacy, but it can be just as powerful, if not more so.
I can already hear some folks saying, wait a minute, wouldn't this approach just get you labeled as weird or cold? There's a lot of societal pressure to be more emotionally expressive.
That's a valid concern. And to be fair, these podcasts, they acknowledge that this model definitely pushes back against some pretty deeply ingrained societal norms.
Right.
We're kind of conditioned to believe that intimacy equals constant emotional expression. So this approach, yeah, it's bound to raise some eyebrows.
It is. But they don't just leave it at that. They bring up some really interesting research to counter those concerns. One of the podcasts talks about how roughly 15–20% of the population actually needs more solitude than the average person to process information and recharge. They're called highly sensitive people, or HSPs.
Right, and it goes beyond personality types. They even bring in some cultural perspectives, like pointing out that in some East Asian cultures, maintaining a moderate social distance is actually the norm. And it's seen as a sign of respect. It's a good reminder that what's considered normal in one culture can be totally different in another.
That's very true. So maybe it's not about rejecting emotions entirely. It's about recognizing that there are different ways to experience and express intimacy. And that leads us to another big question. What about loneliness? Isn't this model basically a one-way ticket to, Lonelyville?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And, it's one that these podcasts tackle head on. They actually suggest that the fear of loneliness in this context might be a little overblown.
And how do they back that up?
Well, they argue that we need to take research on loneliness with a grain of salt, because societal biases often creep into research conclusions.
Oh, interesting.
What's considered healthy social interaction in one culture might be seen as clingy or overwhelming in another. It's like assuming everyone needs a daily dose of sunshine when, some people thrive in the shade.
That's a great analogy. So it's not just about how much social interaction you have.
Right.
It's about the quality of those interactions and whether they align with your individual needs.
Exactly. And they go even deeper, drawing a really crucial distinction between solitude and loneliness, which is something a lot of people tend to confuse.
Yeah.
Which is something a lot of people tend to confuse.
I know, I'm guilty of that. What's the difference?
Well, the podcasts, they emphasize the element of agency. So solitude is about consciously choosing to be alone, often to achieve specific goals, like focused work or deep reflection. It's that feeling of being in the driver's seat of your own alone time. Loneliness, on the other hand, is that unwanted feeling of isolation, like, being the only person left on Earth.
So it's the difference between enjoying a solo hike in the mountains
Yeah.
and being stranded on a deserted island.
Exactly. And there's another key difference, too, the psychological impact. The podcasts point out that solitude is often associated with positive feelings.
Okay.
Think clarity, inspiration, a sense of peace. Loneliness, as we all know, usually brings on those negative emotions, sadness, anxiety, maybe even fear.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about social skills? Wouldn't this model, just discourage people from developing strong social connections?
That's a common misconception. And they actually argue the opposite. They suggest that people who genuinely enjoy solitude often have excellent social skills. They just prioritize quality over quantity in their interactions. They're not antisocial. They're just more intentional about who they spend their time with and how they engage with them.
So it's not about being a hermit. It's about being selective with your social energy.
Precisely. And finally, the podcasts highlight the importance of self-awareness. Choosing solitude often reflects a deep understanding of your own needs and preferences. You know when you need that space to recharge and be your best self. Loneliness, on the other hand, can sometimes stem from a lack of self-awareness, not recognizing what truly fulfills you or how to connect with others in a meaningful way.
This is starting to paint a really different picture of what a fulfilling relationship can look like. But even if this model makes sense for independent thinkers, isn't it incredibly hard to find a partner who's actually on board with this whole approach? I mean, wouldn't most people just think you're weird?
That's a real challenge for sure. And they definitely acknowledge that finding a compatible partner is one of the biggest hurdles.
So how do you even go about finding someone who not only understands this approach, but actually embraces it? It's not like there's a dating app for intellectual collaborators.
Not yet, anyway. But they stress the importance of clear communication, early on in the relationship. It's about being upfront about your expectations, your need for solitude, and your boundaries. No more playing coy or trying to fit into a mold that doesn't feel authentic.
So rip off the Band-Aid, so to speak.
Exactly. And they offer some really practical advice too. Share your work habits, your life philosophy, even your quirks early on. It's all about setting the stage for a relationship that feels genuine and supportive for both partners.
Okay, so let's recap for our listeners who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this new information. We've been exploring this new relationship model designed for independent thinkers, those who thrive on solitude, deep thinking, and intellectual stimulation. We've challenged some of the conventional wisdom around relationships and dug into the differences between solitude and loneliness.
And we've seen how this model, while challenging, might offer a more fulfilling path for those who find the traditional model to be a bit too constricting.
But the big question remains, can this really work in practice? Is it just a theoretical ideal? Or can people actually build thriving relationships on this foundation? To help us unpack that, we've got a special guest lined up for our next segment.
Welcome back to the show. We're wrapping up our deep dive into this new relationship model for independent thinkers. And to help us bridge the gap between theory and reality, we've got a special guest joining us today, someone who not only understands these concepts, but actually lives them out in their own life.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're so excited to have you here.
To kick things off, could you share a bit about your own journey and how you came to embrace this, less conventional approach to relationships? What sparked that shift for you? Sure. For a long time, I felt like I was trying to fit a square peg into a round hole when it came to relationships. I always craved a lot of alone time. I get super energized by deep conversations, and the constant demand for emotional availability in traditional relationships just left me feeling drained. It wasn't until I stumbled across some of these podcasts we've been discussing today that I realized there might be a different way to do relationships, one that actually aligned with my needs and personality. It was like a light bulb moment.
That's so relatable, and I think a lot of our listeners might be feeling that same sense of aha right now. But let's get practical. We've talked about the theory, but what are some of the real-world challenges you've faced in actually living this approach? What surprised you? What were the biggest hurdles?
Well, one of the first things I realized is that societal expectations are a powerful force. Even when you know intellectually that there's nothing wrong with needing more space or prioritizing intellectual connection, it can still be tough to shake that feeling that you're doing something wrong or that you're not being a good partner. There were definitely times when I felt judged or misunderstood by people who just couldn't wrap their heads around this approach.
That makes sense. It's one thing to read about it in a book or hear about it on a podcast, but it's a whole different ballgame to actually put it into practice when you're swimming against the current of, societal norms.
Exactly. And then there's the challenge of finding a partner who's on the same wavelength. It's not always easy to find someone who understands and embraces this need for intellectual stimulation and autonomy. I had my fair share of awkward dates where I try to explain my approach and you could just see their eyes glazing over.
I can only imagine. But clearly you've managed to make it work. What advice would you give to our listeners who are intrigued by this model but maybe feeling a little hesitant or unsure if it's right for them? Where should they even begin?
I'd say the first step is to really get clear on your own needs and values. Ask yourself, how much solitude do you truly need to feel energized and fulfilled? What kinds of conversations light you up? What are your non-negotiables in a relationship? Once you have a good grasp on those things, you can start to explore whether this model aligns with who you are at your core.
That's such a great point. It's about self-awareness, as we were talking about earlier. Knowing yourself is the foundation for building any kind of healthy relationship, whether it's conventional or unconventional.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to start small. You don't have to overhaul your entire relationship style overnight. Maybe start by setting clearer boundaries in your existing relationships or seeking out friendships with people who share your intellectual interests. It's about gradually moving towards a way of relating that feels more authentic to you.
That's such practical, actionable advice.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences with us. It's truly inspiring to see how you've created a fulfilling relationship that honors your own unique needs and those of your partner.
It's a powerful reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to relationships. What matters most is finding a way to connect that feels genuine and sustainable for everyone involved.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. How might this model evolve in the future? As technology advances and social norms continue to shift, how might we see this approach to relationships adapt and change? It's an exciting question to consider. Thanks for joining us on this journey of exploration.